So far, Fire Emblem has had a breakout hit, a strange but interesting experiment, and a timeless classic sequel. What direction does the series go in for its fourth installment? For Fire Emblem, that seems to be bigger, more grand experiments. The fourth Fire Emblem game is a whole lot different from the rest of the series. It stars a new cast of characters in a new setting, with a much different structure as well. It introduced a lot of new mechanics, and a good amount of them returned in other games, some exactly as they were, others in modified form. The scale of the game is so massive that it spans 2 generations of characters, in fact, hence the title, Genealogy of the Holy War. Genealogy starts with a timeline detailing the history of Yggdrasil, the game's setting. Oh yeah, get used to the Norse names because this game has a heavy Norse theme. Already we can see the writers were really looking to build a world here, as the opening chapter describes the various countries, their rulers, their relationships. The writers also wanted a story with a bigger scale. When the game starts, there's already a war going on, but our hero, Siegfried, isn't involved in it at all. He's busy dealing with bandits kidnapping a local noblewoman, and the conflict only escalates from there. These first few chapters actually have a really interesting political conflict to them, and there's a lot of nuance to the characters that join you. Some of them don't even like Siegfried that much, at least at first. Characterization reaches new heights as there are a lot more scenes with the minor characters of your party which make their motivations more clear. One thing you'll notice upon entering the first chapter is that the map is massive, and this is just the first chapter. Genealogy's maps involve moving across a vast landscape, capturing castles along the way, which means there aren't any indoor chapters, but I can live with that. The massive maps have a lot going on in them, and last a lot longer individually than an average Fire Emblem chapter. It's for this reason that there are only 12 chapters in the game, but boy are they big! Luckily, you can save once per turn on any turn you please, so make use of that often. Just make sure you don't accidentally save into an unwinnable situation because you can't reset back to the start of a chapter if you save over that file. You're going to want to use a second save slot if you try something risky. Some might say being able to save any time makes it easier to revert mistakes. I say this game's length and difficulty justify it well enough. The long, vast maps are one of the ways in which Genealogy hasn't aged well, as most experiments tend to. The vast space the battles take place in means that the typical way a fight plays out is a group of enemies rushes your position, you take them down, then you have to walk all the way to where the castle is, take out the enemies just sitting there defending it, take the castle, rinse and repeat. There's an awful lot of just walking, especially if a new unit is far away from wherever your main army is positioned. Not to mention that foot soldiers are going to fall behind, given how fast cavalry moves in this game. They can even use their remaining movement after an attack if they so choose. In fact, the game lampshades this problem by giving you a knight unit, hardly a fast-moving class, and suggesting you leave him to guard your home castle. He's almost a joke character, in fact. In the first chapter, only 2 of your units don't have mounts, and not many after that do. Still, it's tolerable to a certain degree. The map design isn't really a deal breaker. Well, except for one. I really didn't like Chapter 7, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but hear me out. Chapter 7 is one of the 2 desert missions, where cavaliers suck because the sand slows them down, but uh-oh! This is Genealogy, so naturally your entire army is mostly cavalry. You're supposed to take the North Castle first, and only the main character can do this, and he has to take this awfully long path up there and waste a bunch of time. Meanwhile, new characters are under attack in the opposite corner of the map, and how long they last varies based on numerous other factors. So not only is this map wasting your time, you kind of have to hustle to make it to your new characters so they don't die, which on my playthrough they all did. To alleviate some of the movement issues, there are a number of new utility staves in this game. Warp returns, but it can only send a unit to an allied castle. There's the new return staff, which will send a unit to the home castle, and the rescue staff, which will pull an allied unit towards the caster. Now, you better believe I used all of these to level up my clerics. Map design in this game is really hit or miss, which is why I say this experiment is showing its age. There's a lot more to talk about in Genealogy, though. Item management is annoying in this game, because for some reason they decided units should never trade with each other, and they also decided every unit should have their own unique wallet, and they can't give each other money by default either. There aren't a lot of items to actually get in Genealogy, but you can now repair weapons for a fee, and if you need to swap items, you can do that by selling it to a pawn shop and then having the item's new owner buy it back. Yeah. Item shops, pawn shops, weapon repair, and item storage are located in the various castles you take over. Every chapter sees your party receive income as well, and thieves now steal gold instead of items, and for some reason are able to give money to anyone they want. I'd love to hear the real-world justification for that one. Anyhow, there's another way to earn money: arenas. These are no longer life-threatening. Losing just takes you down to 1 HP, and you don't bet money, but each character can only fight 7 times. Very much more forgiving, but also rewarding if you go the extra mile and actually beat all 7 rounds. Several of Genealogy's inventions stick around for the rest of the series, and one of these is the weapon triangle. Swords get an advantage against axes, axes get an advantage against lances, and lances get an advantage against swords. This was a huge addition as players now had to pay attention to weapon matchups, and there was an actual reason to choose one weapon type over the other depending on the situation. This is also good for axes in particular because up to this point in the series, axes pretty much disappeared after like the 10th chapter or so, and few weapon types had any defining features either. That all changed in part thanks to the weapon triangle. The axe specialist in this game actually packs a punch, let me tell you! Weapon ranks also become a series mainstay. Units no longer had a single stat determining what weapons were available. Instead, these were determined by a letter grade for each individual weapon type. So a unit could be able to use any sword but only certain lances. These don't increase in Genealogy unless you promote, however. Speaking of weapon types, magic was also expanded to include 5 different elements of magic, with its own triangle like weapons had. Finally, weapons keep track of the number of kills they've gotten, and if you get enough kills with a single weapon, the crit rate of the weapon starts to rise. Finally, army leaders have a stat called leadership, which grants a bonus to all units in their army. But the most incredibly inventive addition to Fire Emblem has to be the skill system. Units possess a number of passive abilities that are either always active or activated at random. The ability to attack multiple times depending on your speed stat is a skill in this game, pursuit to be precise. Critical hits are also considered a skill, which means not every unit can crit and not every unit can double attack. Other skills include Luna, which randomly activates and ignores defense for that attack when activated, and Soul, which recovers health while dealing damage. Charisma gives nearby units a boost, Prayer can save you from a lethal hit, and the mighty Astra, the signature attack of the Sword Mistress era, allows the unit to attack up to 5 times in one round. Skills, simply put, are an excellent addition as they make all of the characters a lot more unique. It's no longer just about growths. Of course, it should be noted that a good number of the skills activate at random, rather being commands or passive abilities, so these are not completely reliable, but they add so much to the characters as individuals that it's definitely a worthy addition to the game. But that's not even the end of it. Classical RPG status effects were added. These include Sleep, which makes the unit unable to act, Silence, which shuts up mages, and Berserk, which causes the unit to attack any other, indiscriminate of what side they're on. If the player knows where to look, they too can use these effects against their enemies. Helps out against those crazy mage bosses. This is one of the additions that seems more helpful to the enemy than you, though. So what if you put somebody to sleep when you're going to kill them anyways? Still, nothing beats watching the final boss be done in by his own minion. Rare as it is to see that happen even if you do have Berserk. This is also the first Fire Emblem game to utilize a ranking system. You get graded based on how you play, the criteria being how many turns you took to finish, how many characters died, how much EXP they collectively earned, and how many deaths you incurred. Wait, what? I said that already? Well, yeah, see, the rankings in this game track how many times a character died, meaning that even if you reset after a death, the game still remembers it, and this is probably the reason going for a ranked run is a horrible, horrible idea, because it demands absolute perfection. I mean, this is Fire Emblem. The game expects mistakes. You're generally expected to get at least one unlucky whiff on an attack, or have the enemy deal an unlucky critical to you. Death is still permanent, and with the character cast only slightly bigger than Guidance, it's more punishing too. There is a revival staff, but it costs a lot of money to repair for a second use, and it can be lost permanently as well. One of the most defining traits of Genealogy itself has got to be the one the game is named for: relationships and children. There are several single female characters you can recruit. If they stand next to a man long enough, and I do mean long enough, a very long time in fact, they become attracted to that man. You might notice a name next to the field for lover in their profile. Lovers can give each other gold. What? And gain bonuses when fighting together. But the big reason to play Matchmaker in this game is that, due to a plot event which sees Siegfried and his entire army betrayed and killed — oh yeah, spoilers I guess, even though you know it's coming the instant the second generation is mentioned — the game fast forwards a few years, and your old army is replaced by their children. This kind of twist is something you don't often see these days. I mean, death is still permanent in this game, but killing off your entire army that you spent all that time building up? No game is gonna want to do that. It'd be seen as negating all the work you did on them. But in this game, that work does translate into better characters for the second half. The children's stats, skills, and inventories are all inherited to a certain degree from the parents. For example, both of Ira's children will get her insane Astra skill. Another character has the elite skill, which doubles EXP gained. He can pass that on to his children if he's a father. One of your characters is also a wind mage who wields the strongest wind magic spell in the entire game. He can pass that on to his son if he fathers a mage. It's up to the player to choose who inherits what, and if you play your cards right, you could end up with an army of invincible badass heroes succeeding where their parents failed. Any children that can't exist because their mother died are given subpar substitute characters to make sure your numbers don't fall behind, but the game is completable regardless of whether you've made good matchmaking decisions or bad ones. The enemies in this game are incredibly powerful compared to the last game, considering that stats aren't capped at 20 anymore, but your ability to create even more powerful characters more than makes up for it. Though on occasion, you can still run into trouble. Thing is, the second half of the game is seen even by the fans as the weaker of the two. While the plot of the first half had a lot of political intrigue, the second half basically boils down to the usual for Fire Emblem. Evil Empire has been created, main character forms rebellion to liberate the continent. In fact, I'd argue that this setup is contrived. In Chapter 1, Siegfried meets a mysterious girl named Dierdre and instantly falls in love with her. Problem is, the evil Dark Bishop Manfroy is out to capture her and get her hitched with her distant cousin Alvis. They're both descendants of Loki, so getting them in bed together will produce a vessel for him to take over the world. And this all goes smoothly until Siegfried's kid, Selif, shows up and teams up with Diadora's other kid, who is instead a vessel for the divine dragon Naga, which means she can trivialize the final battle of the game. So much for the climactic battle with an evil god. The contrived part is that Dierdre was living in a forest in the middle of Verdane that Siegfried just so happened to meet her in, which explains Manfroy's presence there, come to think of it. But just what would have happened if Dierdre hadn't married Siegfried and conveniently gotten kidnapped in a later chapter because she stupidly decided to exit the castle for no reason? Would Manfroy have found her? But then why didn't he already have her by the time Siegfried got there? I believe time constraints probably play into why the second generation comes off a bit weak. There was a manga for this game that goes into greater detail on Manfroy's motivation for doing all this, which the actual game only touches upon. I've even heard that there were actually plans for chapters beyond the 12 we've got, but time constraints didn't allow it. Makes you wonder what could have been, huh? Well, seeing as Genealogy is pretty high on the Fire Emblem remake wishlist, I suppose it could happen one of these days. And yes, you heard it here first, incest creates evil gods, which is why the player is allowed to make an incestuous pairing involving an underage exhibitionist dancer and the current pope. Doing so allows their son to wield the revival staff in the second half of the game. Oh my god, is this supposed to be some kind of commentary? I mean, the Thracia subplot is pretty messy too, where the future wielder of the strongest lance in the game is kidnapped as a baby by the archetypical Wyvern country after they slaughter her entire family, and then she's raised by the country that kidnapped her, also they could be in control of her lance. Oh my goodness, this game isn't afraid to get into some really touchy subjects. It's even stated in-universe that the Loki worshippers kidnap children and make them kill each other so they can raise only the strongest in their new empire. When fans of the later games started trying out the older Fire Emblems back in the day, Genealogy was one of the games that stood out to them the most for how unique it was, and it's still a fan favorite nowadays. Strangely, it didn't find nearly the same success in its home country, which may have been due to it being very different from the highly successful Mystery of the Emblem, and it used new characters rather than a familiar cast. Today, the game is still very much playable, though I didn't personally enjoy it enough to give it a third playthrough. Though I definitely appreciate the new ideas it put forward, many of which were tweaked and refined in later entries into the series. It's definitely worth trying out at least once. Give it a shot! Coming up next, Rush Development, Crying Children, Washed Up Game Designers. It's all coming next time on Ephraim's Still Bitter Towards Fire Emblem Thracia 776.